Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for Turn Your Yard into a Biodiversity Hotspot. We're going to be looking at biodiversity water conservation in our yards. My name is Kristen Bowman, and I'm an East Bay Mud Water Conservation Program Manager, and I'm here with Dr. Doug Tallamy, entomologist with the University of Delaware. Before we begin, just a few things about logistics. Everyone is on mute, but you do have access to the Q&A button, and you're welcome to use that dialog box. We'll try to answer some questions throughout the webinar, but we will be having a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the presentation. Everyone, this video is being recorded, so by participating you do agree to be on a recorded webinar, and we will be sending out a link to this webinar and other resources that we talk about today. There's going to be a very short evaluation sent to you at the end. It's about 3 questions long, and if you just take a minute to fill that out, that would be super helpful. So to begin, what we're going to be covering today is a little bit about EB Mud's water supply, rebates, and resources, and then we're going to go into our special presentation on turning your yard into a biodiversity hotspot. We'll end with a question and answer section. I also just want to bring your attention on November 2nd at 6 p.m. We have a companion webinar on native plant favorites for a harmonious garden, where we're going to be talking about 4 native plants like Arctostaphylos, sage, ceanothus, and buckwheat, and how to design and maintain these garden favorites. So you can sign up for that at ebmud.com/events. So many of you may know that our water comes from the Tallamy River watershed, and 90% of our water is from snowmelt, which makes it very high quality. This provides water for up to 1.4 million customers. EB Mud water supply starts at the Tallamy River watershed, you see up here on the right, and then it dumps into the Party Reservoir, follows 90 miles of aqueducts into our service area, and gets distributed to our customers. During a drought, we also have access to pumping off the Sacramento through our Freeport pumping station. EB Mud customers did an amazing job in our last drought, saving over 10 billion gallons of water. And currently, our total system water supply is about 84% full, which is a little bit higher than usual. As you know, we had such a rainy winter that really helped our water supply. But due to climate change and weather extremes are more frequent and longer in duration, we do ask people to adopt what we're calling a water conservation culture. And that is really using water conservation as a daily habit, both at home and at work, indoors and outdoors. So a few things to help you with that. We have a landscape rebate program up to $2,000 for residential properties and $15,000 for commercial properties. And one of our rebates that really ties in well with what Doug will be talking about today is our lawn conversion super rebate, which uses native plants. We ask you to sheet mulch and plant in the cool season to take care of the winter rains. Some people get stuck on the design portion of it and like how to move forward. So we do have a landscape design assistance program to help you get started. In addition, we have irrigation rebates. If you'd like to change your sprinklers to drip irrigation or upgrade your controller. We also have lots of resources to help you with all these projects. We have a Water Smart Gardens video playlist, and you can find DIY, how to sheet mulch, plant selection, finding leaks. We also, every Tuesday, have landscape rebate office hours from 12 to 1, and this is virtual to help you through your landscape conversion. And you may consider visiting a neighborhood demonstration garden. And if you go to EB Mud Sustainable Landscape Map, you'll find an interactive map here to find gardens in your neighborhood. And we have many, many more resources at ebmud.com/watersmart, mulch coupons, and plant designs, plant lists, etc. So as Doug is sharing his screen, I am going to introduce him. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Doug Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 112 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 42 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His books include Bringing Nature Home, The Living Landscape, co-authored by Rick Dark, Nature's Best Home, a New York Times bestseller, and The Nature of Oaks, winner of the American Horticultural Society's 2022 Book Award. In 2021, he co-founded Homegrown National Parks with Michelle Alfandari. His awards include recognition from the Garden Writers Association, Audubon, the National Wildlife Federation, Allegheny College, Eco-Foresters, the Garden Club of America, and the American Horticultural Association. We are so thrilled to have you here with us, Doug, to inspire and share your wisdom.
Well, thanks very much, Kristen. A lot of great information in that introduction. That's wonderful. So we're going to talk about turning your yard into a biodiversity hotspot. And if you do that, you will be nature's best hope. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what E.O. Wilson's idea of nature's best hope was. He, of course, was a very famous entomologist, biologist, ecologist, conservationist at Harvard. His career spanned more than 60 years. And one thing that was consistent throughout that very long career was his effort to save life on planet Earth. He loved biodiversity, and he wanted to save it not just because he loved it, but because he knew it was essential to our own survival. So in 2016, he wrote this book, Half Earth, Our Planet's Fight for Life, and he had one simple message. He said, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, very bold statement, if we're going to save life anywhere on planet Earth, we're going to have to save nature. We're going to have to save functioning ecosystems on at least half of the planet, or it's going to disappear everywhere. And he spent most of the book talking about the science that supports that very bold statement. And then he ended the book. He didn't spend a lot of time telling us how we were going to save nature on half of planet Earth. Of course, to a conservation biologist, that's a great idea. We'll just put half the Earth aside, and all those things that are in trouble can be in that half, and we humans can be in the other half. But half of terrestrial Earth is already in some form of agriculture. And we've got 8 billion people and all of our hardscape, detritus, airports, everything else in the other half. And we don't have a third half to put aside for nature. So a lot of people are wondering how we can actually realize E.O. Wilson's dream. That's really what I want to talk about today. I think we can realize that dream, but we do need a new approach to conservation to do it. Before we talk about that, though, let's talk about what happened on the East Coast in 2019, and it's actually happening again this year, having a very large oak mast. Members of the red oak group got together and decided to make their acorns at the same time. That's what it looked like in a lot of places. Well, I'm easily entertained, so I took one of those acorns and I just stared at it, and I was rewarded because an insect started to chew its way out of the acorn. First, it chewed a little hole for its head, then it forced its head through there, then it forced its entire body through that hole. It was a tight squeeze. And once it's free from the acorn, it's dangerous time because a lot of things are after it. So it gets to safety by wiggling and squirming beneath the soil surface. That takes about 30 seconds. And once it's underground, it stretches in all directions and forms a chamber. And within that chamber, converts itself to a pupa. And then surprisingly, stays in that underground chamber as a pupa for 2 years. After 2 years, comes out as an acorn weevil. That's what an acorn weevil looks like. A lot of people think weevils have big noses because it looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule. And the mouth parts are way down there at the end of that extension. They take those mouth parts, chew a hole into the center of the acorn, turn around and lay an egg in that hole. And that's how the larva gets into the acorn. Why don't they come out the next year? Why do they spend 2 years underground? Well, it takes red oak acorns 18 months to complete their development. And that's true for acorns of a number of species of oak. So if they came out the next year, there wouldn't be enough acorns for them. Of course, after they leave their acorn, that leaves a hole, kind of like a true vacuum, and you know that nature abhors a vacuum. And in this case, she's filled it with 3 species of temnothorax ants, tiny little ants where the entire colony lives in the holes made by acorn weevils after they have left the acorn. And if scouts find a new hole in a new acorn, they get all excited because their old acorn, their home, is falling apart. So they tell everybody it's time to move the colony. Of grab the larvae, grab the eggs. They move the entire colony into the new acorn. Takes about 30 minutes. Then they post a guard there and make sure nobody else will come in. And this is where they'll live for the next 2 years until this acorn falls apart. What's my point with this little story? Well, that's just one of literally millions of very specialized interactions that comprise the bulk of nature, largely between animals and plants. And this is another one, relationship between jays and acorns. Jays are the primary disperser of oak acorns. They'll take an acorn, they'll fly up to a mile from the parent tree, then they tap it below the surface of the soil. And the object is they're going to go back and get that acorn in the wintertime and have something to eat. But for every 4 acorns they bury, they only remember where one is. So for every 4 acorns they bury, they've actually planted 3 oak trees. Specialized interaction between pileated woodpeckers and carpenter ants. That's what they rear their young on, carpenter ants. So you won't have pileated woodpeckers unless you have a lot of carpenter ants, and you won't have a lot of carpenter ants unless you have the big trees that make those carpenter ants. You won't have this beautiful moth, the beloved Emarginia, unless you have mistletoe, and you won't have mistletoe unless you have the oaks that support that mistletoe. That is the only plant that that moth can develop on. You won't have 60 species of trees, of bees in California if you don't have the blooms of perennial sunflowers. It turns out that pollen specialization is very common in our native bees. We got between 3,600 and 4,000 species of native bees, and over a third of them can only reproduce on the pollen of particular plants. So nature really is a series of very specialized relationships. The point I want to make this afternoon, though, is that many of these relationships, actually most of them these days, are in trouble. Nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not take Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, Teddy heard that the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. So he went to the canyon, stood on the edge, and he looked out over its wondrous scene, and he said, "Leave it as it is." And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, we didn't leave most of the country as it was. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological condition. And those are typically mountaintops. And that's because we have logged the country repeatedly. We have tilled it. We have drained it. We have grazed it. That's 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. That's 4.5 times the size of Texas, dedicated to cattle. And of course, we paved it or otherwise developed it. We have straightened our rivers and dammed them. You can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are running amok in our natural areas. In short, we've carved up those natural areas into tiny remnants of their former selves. And each one of those remnants is too small and too isolated to sustain the amount of nature that we humans need, because it is nature. It is natural ecosystems that sustain us on this planet. So why have we done this? I don't know, but I suspect. We thought our nest, planet Earth, was so large we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're seeing some pretty scary headlines these days, like the insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. Followed by this one, North America's lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. That's a third of our North American bird population already gone. Now, the UN says, well, gee, we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction, probably in the next 20 years. They said it 2 years ago, so I guess that's the next 18 years now. This is a prediction, hasn't happened yet, although they did just post 21 new and extinct species last week. So it is happening, and we have to make sure it stops happening. We've got to make sure that these species do not disappear because they are the ones that are keeping us alive. So I could go on talking about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, and as Shakespeare would say, upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talks about. This talks about a cure for that pox. It's a cure that'll take small efforts from lots of people like you and me. But those efforts to deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, back to E.O. Wilson. He told us what it would mean if Earth lost its insects, and he did it way back in 1987 with this paper, The Little Things That Run the World. And again, his message was very clear. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if they were to disappear, So would most of our flowering plants. And if most of our flowering plants disappeared, that would so drastically change energy flow through our terrestrial ecosystems that the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, and our mammals, those food webs would collapse and all those animals would disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we would have lost insect decomposers and all we would have is bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans wouldn't survive any of those drastic changes. There is some good news. And that is that none of that has to happen. We can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But we're going to have to change the way we landscape in order to do it. Why is that? Well, remember, humans are products of nature. We are totally dependent on the life support that ecosystems provide. These are just a few things that plants do that we depend on every day, like the production of oxygen. Pretty important. Clean water. You know how important clean water is. And of course, plants are slowing its journey to the sea where it becomes too salty to use. Carbon capture, enormously important today. Plants are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of that carbon, and then pumping the extra carbon that they harness into the ground through their root systems. 40% of the carbon that plants capture ends up in the ground, where it becomes extremely stable. If the ground's not disturbed, it'll stay there for thousands of years. Plants build topsoil and they hold it in place. They prevent floods. They dampen severe weather. They convert sunlight into food. If we lose our plants, we're going to have to eat sunlight. That will be hard. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate nearly 90% of our flowering plants. They disperse plant seeds. So designing landscapes like this that destroy the production of ecosystem services is just not a good idea. Never was a good idea, but today it's a terrible idea because of those 8 billion people demanding more and more ecosystem services every day. Now, we do have parks and we do have preserves and they're doing the best they can, but we're in the 6th great extinction event that the planet has ever experienced, which means it's not good enough. The solution is to simply practice conservation outside of parks and preserves on landscapes just like this. There have been visionaries through the ages who have recognized that we humans needed to work on our relationship with planet Earth. And Aldo Leopold was one of the most eloquent. He wrote extensively in the first half of the 1900s. And one of the things he said is the oldest task in human history is to live in a piece of land without spoiling it. Now, there have been indigenous groups who have been good at doing that for long periods, but our huge Western societies and our huge Asian societies are terrible at doing that. We habitually take more from the earth than it has to offer, completely wrecking an area, going to another area, doing the same thing, not sustainable behavior. But Aldo Leopold had a lot of faith in humans. He believed we were capable of developing what he called a land ethic. He knew we had to use the land. We had to farm and lumber and graze and do all of those things, but he believed we could learn to do them gently enough that we did not destroy local ecosystems. That's what he called the land ethic, and he wrote about it in the Sand County Almanac, his most famous book. What he did not write about was developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect the notion that humans and nature cannot live together. We cannot coexist in the same place at the same time. That notion was so deeply embedded in the culture of Aldo Leopold's day, still embedded in our own culture. He may not have recognized it as an option. Well, what I want to argue this afternoon is that not only is living with nature an option, it is now the only viable option that's left to us. In the past, of course, conservation has worked pretty much exclusively where there weren't a lot of people. We now need to turn that on its head and practice conservation where there are a lot of people, because that's pretty much everywhere. And that means we've got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes, not hang on by a thread, not get diminished every year, but thrive. Where should we start? Well, back to private property. Most of the country is privately owned. 78% of the entire country is privately owned. 85.6% east of the Mississippi is privately owned. If we don't practice conservation on private property, we're going to fail. And of course, we can't afford to fail. When I use the word conservation, I'm not using it exactly the way I mean. We do want to conserve any bits of nature that are left out there. Absolutely. That has been our conservation model for the last century, and we want to continue doing that. But we now have to go beyond that. We have to move into restoration. We have to restore nature in many, if not most of the places where we've dismantled her. And you will hear, well, gee, you're never going to put it back together again exactly the way it was. And That's true. We won't. There too many things have changed. But we can reunite enough of those specialized interactions to form functioning ecosystems once again, even if it's not exactly what was in that space at some point in the past. But in order to do that, we have to start with the building blocks. Not all species contribute to ecosystem function equally, so we have to start with the most important groups. And there are two groups we can't do without. One is the flowering plants. And of course, the pollinators that allow those plants to reproduce, they are capturing energy from the sun and through photosynthesis, turning it into simple sugars and carbohydrates, which is the food. That is the food that supports just about all the animals on the planet. So now you have the food that the animals need locked up in plant tissues, mostly their leaves. But if you don't get that food to the animals, you don't have any animals. If you don't have any animals, you don't have functional ecosystems. Well, it turns out that most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. Most vertebrates eat invertebrates that ate plants. Most of those invertebrates are insects, and not just any insect. Caterpillars, it turns out, are transferring more energy from plants to other animals than any other type of plant eater. So if we design landscapes that don't have a lot of caterpillars in them, we're going to have failed food webs and eventually failed ecosystems. I'm going to use the Carolina chickadee as an example. That's the chickadee that's in my yard here in Southeast Pennsylvania. You've got other species of chickadees, and throughout the country, several species. They're all doing pretty much the same thing. One of the things they do is go to our feeders in the wintertime and eat seeds. So we tend to think that's all chickadees need is seeds. Actually, only 50% of their diet in the wintertime is seeds. The other 50% is insects and spiders, even in the wintertime. And when it comes time to reproduce, their babies can't eat seeds at all. So they switch to invertebrates, and if they're in a healthy environment, they will rear their young exclusively on caterpillars. And they are not exceptions. 96% of our terrestrial birds rear their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So something special about caterpillars, what is it? There's a lot of things special about caterpillars, and one of them is that they are soft. Think of this guy as if he's a little sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is its exoskeleton. It's made of chitin. It's undigestible. And because they're soft, you can stuff the caterpillars down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear their young, they're pretty rough. The beak's like a plunger. They just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. Now, some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around, but you want to chase 200 aphids or get one caterpillar. Caterpillars are nutritious. They're very high in fat, very high in protein, low percentage of chitin of exoskeleton compared to other insects, particularly beetles. Beetles are not like little sausages. They're like little tanks. So much of a beetle is undigestible, and a lot of beetles have very sharp edges too. Then finally, it turns out caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. Now, I mention carotenoids, not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate, and you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates, and we vertebrates cannot make our own carotenoids. Only plants make carotenoids. So we have to get our carotenoids from plants. And we have to get them from plants because carotenoids are essential components of vertebrate diets. Where are the birds getting their carotenoids from? Particularly during the breeding season, they're getting them from the prey items they bring back to the nest. But look, carotenoid content is not equally distributed among bird prey items. These first two bars here are types of caterpillars. They have far more carotenoids than other types of bird prey. Here are the adult caterpillars. Here, the moths and butterflies themselves, they have fewer carotenoids because they're not eating the green leaves. That's where the carotenoids are. And here's the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. So that study and several others are suggesting that caterpillars are not optional parts of most bird diets. They are essential parts of most bird diets. So let's just say most birds need caterpillars. The next very important question is, how many do they need? Is one or two enough? Or one or two a day enough? Let's go back to Carolina chickadee. There's a lot of data on Carolina chickadees. How many caterpillars does it take to make a nest of Carolina chickadees? One or two is not enough. One or two a day is not enough. It takes thousands. 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to get one clutch of chickadees to the point where they leave the nest. And that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And after they leave the nest, the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 21 days. So you're really talking about tens of thousands of caterpillars required to get one nest of a bird that's a third of an ounce, 4 pennies worth of bird, through to independence. And if you want caterpillars to breed in your yard, or if you want chickadees to breed in your yard, and I would think you do, because in so many places, that's all we have left is our yards. You got to have all those caterpillars in your yard. because the chickadees are only foraging about 50 meters from the nest. They're not flying 5 miles down the road to the nearest woodlot. And if we landscape in a way that does not include all those caterpillars, that's called insect decline. And it's really looking like insect decline is one of the major causes of the bird declines that people are measuring. We went to the original data set of Rosenberg et al. That's the Smithsonian group who said we've lost 3 billion breeding birds in the last 50 years. And we divided the birds, the terrestrial bird species, into 2 groups. The species that require insects, particularly when they're breeding, and the species that do not require insects when they're breeding. So things like doves and finches and crossbills can actually make a little milk out of seeds and feed their young that milk. So they don't need insects. And look, that group did not decline at all in the last 50 years. But the species that require insects lost on average 10 million individuals per species. This does not prove cause and effect, but it does suggest that as you take bird food away, you lose the birds. And look, it's not just birds that need caterpillars. This is the ornate box turtle, just an example of many other creatures that depend on them. This used to be a common turtle in the Midwest, where it would follow around armyworm and cutworm outbreaks and eat hundreds of caterpillars a day. So we need to raise the bar about what we're asking our landscapes to do. In the past, we've asked them to do one thing, be pretty. Now we have to ask them to do 2 things, and that is be pretty and ecologically sustainable. And that's not going to happen unless we manage our watersheds and put caterpillars back into those landscapes. So how do we do that? How do you add caterpillars to landscapes? Well, you do that by putting the plants that support those caterpillars in your landscape, which seems pretty straightforward, but there is a catch, and that is that most plants do not support a lot of caterpillars. So we have to be fussy about which plants we are choosing, and we have to be fussy about it because the caterpillars themselves are fussy about it. And the monarch butterfly illustrates that perfectly. You can have all the eucalyptus and all of the camellias and calorie pears and crepe myrtles. Who knows all the Asian plants that you use in California to landscape with, but we use them across the country. You can have all of those non-native plants in our landscapes, and you won't make a single monarch butterfly. The only thing that's going to make a monarch butterfly is one of the milkweeds. That is called host plant specialization. And it turns out that most of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. They can only eat particular plants. Why is that? Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction. So they've loaded their leaves with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those leaves either bitter or downright toxic. And it's a really effective defense that keeps most of the insects of the world from eating most of the plants of the world, which is why it's green out there. It's not because there's no insects out there that want to eat those plants. It's because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are too well defended. But we do know that insects eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? Well, this is where the specialization comes in. 90% of the insects that eat plants are host plant specialists, just like the monarch. They can only eat plants for which they have very specialized adaptations that allow them to get around the defenses of particular plant lineages. Specialized enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations that minimize the insect's exposure to those compounds. It takes a long period of evolutionary history interacting with those plant lineages for all those adaptations to fall into place. And once they do, the insect is locked into it. So you can have, you can take the milkweeds out of your yard and replace them with hostas or something else. And the monarch will not be able to switch over and eat your hostas. It's locked into eating milkweed. So if you do that, it has 2 choices: fly away and find milkweed someplace else, or starve to death. So it turns out there's 3 kinds of plants out there. There's plants that harness energy from the sun, turn it into food, and then contribute it to local food webs so that you have other living things there. There are plants that do not contribute energy to local food webs, and there are plants that actively remove energy from local food webs. Best example of a contributor in 84% of the counties in which they occur is one of the oaks. Oaks are passing on more energy to local food webs than any other type of plant, by far. Good example of a non-contributor would be a ginkgo biloba from Asia. It's a nice ornamental plant. It turns nice yellow in the fall, but nothing eats a ginkgo. So it's not adding any energy to a local food web. And a good example of a detractor would be eucalyptus, particularly when it becomes invasive and spreads, because not only is it not passing on energy, it's also expelling the native plants that do pass on their energy. So the end result is an ecosystem with far less energy. So all I'm trying to say here is that plant choice matters. If we're going to rebuild functional food webs, we're not going to do that without having viable if we're going to rebuild functional ecosystems, we're not going to have that without having viable food webs in those ecosystems. And that's not going to happen unless we choose the right plants. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works when we do choose the right plants. These are from the East Coast because that's where I live, but it's the same principle happening everywhere. This is our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. This is where my wife Cindy and I moved in the year 2000 to a farm that had just been sold, broken up into 10-acre lots. Very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years. And the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So there were very few plants there. Well, our job was to put it back together again. But of course, we'd never done that before. So we were just experimenting. One of the things I knew is that we needed to get some caterpillars back. But again, I'd never tried that. I wanted to see if I could get the Canadian owlet, this beautiful little caterpillar, to make a living in our house. I'd never seen a Canadian owlet. That's what one looks like. That's what the adult looks like, just like a leaf. But you're not going to have Canadian owlets unless you have their host plant, meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. It used to grow there, but again, our area was farmed for 300 years, meadow rue long gone. So I got some meadow rue seeds from someplace and I planted them and they grew very nicely. But this was early on and I actually had very little faith the Canadian owlets would be able to find my little patch of meadow rue. So I didn't even go out and check it for at least 2 months after I planted them. Then I walked by for another reason and I glanced over. It was covered with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I'm still impressed with that. So now we have a good population of meadow rue and Canadian owlets. We've added 2 species to that depauperate landscape. Same story with the goldenrod stowaway. That's actually a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It's a specialist on this plant, Biden's aristosa. Ditch daisy. We didn't have any ditch daisy, but I did know where there was some Bidens in a power line cut about 14 miles away. So I got some seeds, planted them at home. They grew very nicely. As a matter of fact, last year they took over my front yard. That's okay. I had to wait a year for the goldenrod stowaway to find my patch of Bidens, but they did. And now we have a good population of both of those. And now we've added 4 species to the property. The restoration is proceeding. Wanted to see if I get the hackberry emperor and make a living at our house. Not because it's the most beautiful butterfly in the world, but because it belongs here. It's one of the species that should be on our property, but isn't. Well, as its name suggests, it's a specialist on hackberry, on celtis. And we didn't have any hackberry. No wonder we didn't have any hackberry emperor. So I planted a couple of hackberry trees. I had to wait 4 years for the hackberry emperor to find my hackberry trees, but they did, and now we've got a good population of them. So now we've added 6 species, and that's how the restoration proceeded. I did not plant goldenrod, came in on its own, and along with it came many of the specialists on goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcigera flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct sparaginothus, the goldenrod gall moth. There are 110 species of caterpillars that use goldenrod in the mid-Atlantic states. I planted Virginia creeper. Now, if you live in the East, you know that most people don't like Virginia creeper, but I don't know why. It's a great native plant. It's got good fall color. It can climb our trees without girdling them, without pulling them down. It's a good ground cover. Makes valuable berries for the birds in the fall. And by valuable, I mean they are high in fat. Our migrating birds need fat to fuel that migration, and our overwintering birds need fat to get them through the winter. And these berries come from tiny little inconspicuous flowers. You don't even know that Virginia creeper is in bloom until you see this big cloud of native bees around it. Remember, when you're making a pollinator garden, you're making it for the pollinators. If it's not big and showy for you, that's okay. I planted Virginia creeper because it's the best host plant of the large sphinx moths that are a primary component of cardinal diets. Things like the Pandora sphinx and its beautiful adult, the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx, all on Virginia creeper. Want to see if I get the evening primrose moth to make a living at our house, just because it's beautiful. I like beauty like anybody else. Well, believe it or not, we didn't have any evening primrose, so I planted it. The moth came, spends a day with its head stuffed in the flowers. Sometimes it's crowded in there, but it's always very cute. And I planted lots of oak trees. Now, these are just examples of the plants we put back on our property. But I want to focus on oaks for a while because they are such important plants. This is the Bedford oak in Bedford, New York, Martha Stewart land. People argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. It's enormous. And I hear people say, I'm not going to plant an oak because I won't live long enough to enjoy it. And if you can only enjoy your oak when it's 400 years old, you're right, you won't. But if you can enjoy what your oak is contributing to your local food web, you can enjoy it right away. And I can say that with confidence because I planted most of my oaks as acorns, which means they were free, or 2-foot bare root whips, which means they cost $1.50 each. And immediately they started to call in the moths that create the caterpillars that run the food web at our house. Things like the solitary oak leaf miner, Juvenil's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, Suzuki's promolactus, the red wash caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the hesitant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the medium dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the orange-patched smoky wing, the white-blotched heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red-line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species of caterpillars have come to the oaks on our property, and they come right away. This is a pin oak that has just popped its head above the leaves, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating the leaves at that tree. You don't have to wait decades or hundreds of years for your oak to start to support the life around you. It will do it right away. Just in case you think all the pretty moths are in the east, that is not true at all. You've got more pretty moths than we do, and here are just a few. We go collecting out there. And I'm always amazed at the diversity that you have in the West, particularly in California. Beautiful things. Okay, this is what our yard looks like today, taken from pretty much the same picture I took that first picture from. Just to convince you, we put some plants back, still working on it. But my research has shown over the years that if you know the number of species of moths in your local food web, moths, not butterflies. Butterflies are day-flying, bad-tasting moths. Because they don't taste very good, they don't contribute a lot to local food webs. But the moths do. So if you know the number of species of moths in your food web, you have a good index of how stable your food web is and how productive your food web is. So 6 years ago, I decided to start the process of recording all the species of moths that are now making a living at our house. I'm still at it, but I'm up to 1,256 species of moths that I've taken pictures of so far. Now we have 10 acres. Pennsylvania is 2.4 million acres. So on 1/240,000th of the landmass, we've recorded 48% of all the moths that occur in the entire state. And because so many of these are types of bird food, we've recorded 62 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Not flew by, but bred. Why am I telling you this? Well, this is another headline we see all the time. The World Wildlife Fund says that Earth has lost 2/3 of its wildlife since 1970. It's a terrible statistic. But I'm thinking, gee, not at our house. I am convinced we have increased biodiversity by more than 2/3. It didn't take that long, and it wasn't that hard. We just put the plants back. What would happen if everybody put the plants back? We really could turn headlines like this around. But a good question is, Cindy and I have 10 acres. Will it work on smaller properties, let's say in suburbia? That's a very good question. So let's go to Marganda and Terpstra's house in Kirkwood, Missouri, where they have 0.6 acres, 18 times less land than Cindy and I have. They're in the middle of a development. Everybody around them has the big lawns. When they moved in, their yard was choked with bush honeysuckle, Amur honeysuckle, another invasive from Asia. So they got rid of that. Then they planted 70 species of native plants, put in a water feature that they call a bubbler. And then they sat back and started to count the birds that are using their yard. And they are up to 149 bird species, including 35 warbler species. If any of you are birders, you know that is a fantastic number. Cindy and I have only recorded 8 warbler species at our house. So does it work on smaller properties? Absolutely. What about urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's house in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago, right on the other side of that wall there is O'Hare Airport. She has 1/10 of an acre, 3 times smaller than the average lot size in North America. She's not connected to any natural area at all. It's a pretty 1/10 of an acre because Pam is a native plant landscaper and she knows what she's doing. But it is an island. It is an isolated island in the middle of Chicago. Well, one of the things she did was get rid of her non-native plants, put in 60 species of native plants, a water feature. And then she sat back and she has She says, with a glass of wine, and started counting the birds that are using her yard. And she's up to 100, it's actually 125 bird species now that have used her yard, that she's recorded in her yard, including a woodcock. Here's Pam's woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, go to Pam's house in Chicago. All right, there's 4 things we need to think about if we're going to succeed in a big way. And one of the things we have to do countrywide is think about all that area we have in lawn. Last figure I saw was 44 million acres of lawn. That's an area bigger than the size of New England, dedicated to an ecological deadscape. Now, we know why we do this. It's a status symbol. We love our status symbols. And we have to display our Halloween decorations. But, it's an ecological disaster. There are 4 things that our landscapes have to do. Every landscape has to do if we're going to reach a sustainable relationship with Mother Earth. And one of them is support food webs, sequester carbon, manage our watershed. Every landscape is in a watershed. Nobody has the ethical right to destroy that watershed, and support pollinators. Lawn does none of those things. So what if we reduce the area of lawn? What if we cut that area of lawn in half? What if we took spaces like this and turned it into this? I got this picture from Dan Getman. I've never met Dan, but he had this big lawn, and he said, look, I'm doing it. I'm putting the plants back. Okay, well, let's make the math simple. Let's say that we got 40 million acres of lawn. We're going to cut that in half. That'll give us 20 million acres that we can restore right at home. And that's enough area to make a new national park that I'm calling Homegrown National Park. And it'll be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. So Homegrown National Park is going to be the biggest park in the country. What do we get when we put a park at home? What do we get when we put some part of nature right where we live? We get the opportunity to interact with nature at our own time, our own pace. We can, all you have to do is go outside, or maybe even just look out your window. You can avoid crowds. If you go to a real national park, 375 million people there last year. So I know what you're really going to interact with. It's free. There's no admission fee. It's never closed, no matter what pandemic comes down the pike, or no matter how many times the government is shut down. You can avoid travel hassles. These are all really important things to me. You get to experience the natural world alone, which I think is essential to developing that personal, unique relationship with Mother Nature. And it's particularly important for our poor kids who are suffering from nature deficit disorder, according to your own Richard Louv. So we're trying. We get 30 kids, we put them on a bus with a teacher, and they drive for an hour, go to a natural place. They walk around for an hour, and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back in the bus and they go home. And that's their experience with the natural world, which I'm sure is better than nothing. But it's really been an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If they have some part of nature, even if it's very modest, right where they live, all they have to do is go outside and get to know it, become friends with it, fall in love with it, alone, no parental supervision. If we hover over our kids, we're sending the message that this is dangerous stuff. This is not something you're capable of interacting with alone. And that's a terrible message to send to our kids, because they are the future stewards of the planet. If they don't know that, if they don't know what good stewardship is, if they're afraid of being a good steward, if they don't love being a good steward, they're going to be lousy stewards. And we can't afford any more lousy stewardship. Maybe they'll learn how to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my own granddaughter, Zoe, who lives in a very modest patch of nature in Hawaii. It's a piece of grass with a hedge, but there are no lizards there. And when she learned that, she sent me this picture to describe very seriously how you hunt lizards. You get on the ground and you cover yourself with leaves and sticks to make sure the lizards don't see you coming. Then you crawl very slowly toward the lizard. No smiling. This is serious business. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But you sneak up on the lizard, you catch the lizard, you put it in an aquarium, and you learn how to take care of that lizard. You experience that part of nature, and you fall in love with that part of nature. Now, I don't think Zoe's going to be crawling on the ground in her best dress the rest of her life catching lizards. I don't think. She sent me this picture not too long ago, so who knows. But I guarantee she's going to remember those experiences with nature in Hawaii the rest of her life, and I guarantee it's going to help her be a good steward of the planet. And if you want to join Homegrown National Park, you can do it. It's a real thing now, a little nonprofit. Go to our website, homegrownnationalpark.org, and register your property on the map. Just your location and the amount of area of your property you're going to be a good steward of. Maybe you really are going to reduce the bit of lawn that you have. Maybe you're going to plant an oak tree. Maybe you're going to put an aster in a flower pot. Doesn't matter how small it is. Whatever you do, record that, and then your little place is going to light up with a firefly in your county. And you can see who else in your county has joined Homegrown National Park. The object, of course, is to get the message to everybody who doesn't have a clue that they are the future stewards of the earth. They are the future of conservation. We want that message to go viral. We want the whole map to light up. So what are we asking? We really are asking people to reduce the area and lawn. Again, those 4 critically important things are not accomplished by lawn. And we're going to reduce that area and put in the plants that do accomplish those important ecological goals. We want to remove invasive species from our properties. Most people do have invasive species on their property, and they don't even know it. Excuse me. And finally, if we're protecting any natural area, we want to keep doing that. There are really important ecological products associated with Homegrown National Park. One is a significant increase in biodiversity. We've seen that at our house right here in Oxford, Pennsylvania. Measurable reduction in invasive species. You know, if the country's 78% privately owned and everybody got rid of the invasives just on their private property, we would be 78% done. Significant drawdown of atmospheric CO2. Any plant is better at sequestering carbon than lawn is. So if we reduce the area of lawn, we are helping climate change. And we're going to start to build viable habitat outside of parks and preserves. Every bit of conservation we do outside of a park helps conservation inside of a park. There are also important sociological products associated with Homegrown National Park, and one is national awareness, not just what the problems are, but what the solutions are and what our roles in those solutions are. We want to change the culture. We want people to recognize that nature's not optional. It's not there just to entertain us. It's essential for everybody, and that means everybody owns responsibility to sustaining it. We want to convert hope into action. Hope is good, but action's even better. And we want to merge all of the existing conservation organizations into one visual, the map. So Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, California Native Plant Society, all the land conservancies, they're doing wonderful conservation on private property, but none of it's being recorded in a coordinated way. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to join Homegrown National Park. What plants should we put in the area that was once lawn? I'm going to argue that some of them have to be what I'm calling keystone plants. Remember what a keystone is. It's a stone in the middle of the Roman arch. And if you take that stone out of the arch collapses. Well, if you take keystone plants out of your local food web, the food web collapses because they are making most of the food. Just 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food that drives those food webs. So think of the keystone plants in the ecological house that you're building as the 2x4s that hold that house up. They're the support system. They're, you can't do without them. You can't build a house out of wallpaper, and that's what we've been trying to do for the last century. What's the best keystone plant across the country? It's one of our oaks. We've got 91 species of oaks. They support 270 species of caterpillars in California, over 950 species nationwide. No other plant genus comes close to that. How do you find the best keystone species where you live? Well, you folks in California have a wonderful tool called CalScape, the California Native Plant Society. Every single native plant population is geo-referenced on a big map of California. And you can look at that map and see where you live, and then you know what plants belong where you live. And then they're ranked in terms of their ability to support the life around you. Wonderful tool. I wish every state had that. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to invite a lot of insects to our yard, and then we're going to kill them with our security light, which of course is not the goal. It turns out that light pollution at night is one of the major causes of insect declines. And these are all the ways that lights are killing our insects, particularly the moths that make those caterpillars that run the food web. This, to me, actually is good news. It's good news because we've got to turn around insect declines. We've already lost more than 45% of the insects on the planet, and they are the little things that run the world. So that is not good. If we can turn that around by flicking a switch, we're getting off easy. But there are a lot of switches we have to flick, but there's a lot of us to do that flicking. But a lot of people say, well, gee, I can't turn the light out over my barn or over my garage or over my front porch because the bad man will come. All right, put a motion sensor on your light so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you're going to realize is the bad man does not come very often. And if you don't want to do that, take the white bulb out of your security light and put in a yellow bulb. They're sold at the hardware store, yellow LEDs or yellow incandescent lights. Yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to nocturnal insects. So if we switched out our white bulbs for yellow bulbs overnight, we would save millions of insects. And if we used LEDs, we'd save millions of dollars as well. So we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. We're going to modify our light system. Then we're going to invite one of the mosquito foggers to come kill all of our insects. This is a booming business around the country. And they say it's okay because what they're fogging is a natural product. And it is a natural product. It's pyrethroids, which is the insecticide that chrysanthemums have evolved in order to kill insects. It's industrial strength pyrethroids, but it is natural. But so is cyanide, so is ricin. Some really nasty things are made by nature and totally naturally. So I don't think that's a good argument. They also say it only kills mosquitoes, and that's not even close to true. This is the result of a fogging event on the eastern shore of Maryland, and this is happening all over the country. That's our beloved monarch. Of course, you folks in California can't afford to lose one monarch. You're down to 99.9% of the population that used to be there. So fogging to kill mosquitoes, when it really kills the pollinators and the monarchs, is not the way to go. What's interesting is it does not control mosquitoes. We're doing this for nothing. When I say it doesn't control mosquitoes, I mean, you don't control mosquitoes in the adult stage. You have to kill 90% of them to get good control. These guys kill between 10 and 50%, so they're not even close to getting good control. If you really want to control mosquitoes, you do it with biological control through mosquito dunks. Get a bucket, fill it full of water, put in a handful of straw or hay or maybe some leaves and put it out in the sun where it'll build up populations of diatoms and algae. And that is what mosquito larvae eat. This becomes an irresistible brew to any mosquito in your yard that wants to lay her eggs, and she'll lay them in your bucket preferentially. Then you go to the hardware store and you get a sheet of mosquito dunks. Bacillus thuringiensis. This costs $12. You put in a dunk, the eggs hatch, the larvae eat the dunk. This is, again, Bacillus thuringiensis. It is a natural bacterium that only kills aquatic diptera. And the only aquatic diptera in your bucket is a mosquito larva. So it's extremely targeted. If a dragonfly gets in here, it won't hurt it a bit. If your dog drinks it, no problem. You might put a coarse screen over it so the local ground squirrel doesn't jump in, but it's targeted, it's cheap, and it works, particularly if everybody does it. Okay, the fourth thing we need to do is to think about how we landscape under our trees so that caterpillars can complete their development. I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where, and this is just an example, but oaks support 511 species of caterpillars. A few of them, like the polyphemus moth, complete their development on the tree. The caterpillar eats the leaves, then it spins a cocoon and hangs from one of the branches, then it emerges as an adult, then it does it all over again. Everything happens on the tree. And I wish that were true for all the species, but it's not. Most of the species, 94% of them, finish growing as caterpillars on the tree, and then they drop from the tree. And they wiggle their way beneath the soil surface and pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that's under the tree. And that's the problem. There is no leaf litter under the tree. We don't tolerate it. And we mow and compact the soil under our tree so that it's rock hard. That makes it really tough for those insects, those caterpillars, to get underground, which means this becomes an ecological trap. The moths come in, lay their eggs on these trees, the caterpillars develop and drop down and die. And I am convinced that the way we landscape under our trees is another major cause of insect decline around the country. And of course, the cement landscape is not the answer either. This is what most people do. You got a tree in a yard. I've got a new grad student, Emma Jonas, this year, who is measuring how well caterpillars do in a situation like this. But I guarantee they're going to do better in a situation like this, a layered landscape, where you have you've got a number of layers of plants. Makes it soft landing. You've got the tree, but the caterpillar falls down. through this layer of native vegetation. The soil is not compacted. That's probably the key. Nobody's going to mow it. Nobody's going to step on them. They can easily get underground or spin a cocoon in the litter that's down here. Much higher survivorship. And you've got ground covers as well that will increase caterpillar survivorship. And you want to use them as liberally as you can. Okay, former grad student Desiree Narango did some wonderful work with chickadees in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And her results suggest that there's actually room for compromise in our plant choices. And that's good news. She had one simple question. How well do suburban landscapes support chickadee populations when they are dominated by native plants versus dominated by non-native introduced ornamentals? And when they're dominated by introduced ornamentals, they support 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, you've reduced the amount of bird food by 75%. They were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. Now, everybody had a nest box up in their yard, but the chickadees would come and look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try to breed. If they did try to breed, they laid 1.5 fewer eggs. Those clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all. Those nests, if they did survive, produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to reach maturity. And if you put all that into a population growth model as a function of the percentage of non-native woody plant biomass, from none to 100% that is in your yard, this is what you get. We looked at woody plants because that's where chickadees forage. This dotted line is replacement rate. That's the rate at which the population has to make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. If you reproduce at this rate, you have a sustainable population. It's not growing, but it's not shrinking either. If you make more babies than adults die, and that's what happens when you have very few non-native plants, you have a growing population. But if you make fewer babies than adults die, you've got a shrinking, unsustainable population. And that's what happens when you have a lot of non-native plants. Now, right here is where those lines intersect, very liberally speaking. So you could have up to 30% of your woody plant biomass non-native without destroying the local food web. We can't tolerate any invasive plants. They're ecological tumors that just escape and destroy our local natural areas. But there are many ornamentals that are not invasive. Remember Dan Getman? This is a ginkgo biloba from Asia. What does Dan have a ginkgo in his native planting for? Well, Dan's wife likes ginkgos, and she said, please put one in. So he did. The point is this ginkgo wrecking the productivity of this planting here? No, it's not. Is it going to escape and wreck the woodlot? No, it's not. It's just there. It's not contributing, but it's just there. So I like to think of plants that are just kind of standing there as if they're statues. So there you go. There's Dan's statue. If everything was a statue, Dan would not have a functional landscape. But it's not the presence of non-native plants that destroys food webs. It's the absence of those big contributors, those native plants that are supplying most of the energy. If we increase the percentage of these, we can tolerate some of these. Can we use native plants in formal designs? Of course we can. This is a Lynn O'Shaughnessy design taken by a drone 400 feet up. You do not get more formal than that. And every plant in that design is a native plant. Formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. They love them over there. If they can love our native plants, we can too. Can we get a pollinator garden into a typical suburban yard like this without offending anybody? Of course we can. Put a little fence around it. It formalizes it, tells your neighbors it's not a bunch of weeds you forgot to mow. It's pretty when it's in bloom. It's meeting the needs of several species of bees. It's not very big. Could be bigger, but if everybody did it, it would help a lot. Help what? Help make pollinators. Why do we need pollinators? Well, the media will tell you because they pollinate 1/3 of our crops. It's really about 1/12 of our crops. And I hear people say, well, I don't live next to a farm, so I don't need any pollinators. Forget the crop argument. We need pollinators because it pollinates 80% of all plants and 90% of all flowering plants, not just our crops. Where do we need pollinators? Everywhere we need plants, which is everywhere. You've got some wonderful pollinator plants there too, which are always also really important ornamentals like California lilac. You've got a number of native asters, really critical for migrating monarchs, by the way. This is a Drew Latham design. It's much bigger than that first one. Imagine the amount of life supported here versus the amount of life supported here. Seems like a no-brainer. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Yes, they can, and more of them are doing it. Minnesota has a cost-sharing plan to encourage homeowners to reduce or eliminate their lawn and replace it with appropriate Minnesota prairie plants. It's very popular. Pennsylvania has a similar program. It's underfunded, so there's a big, long waiting list. There's an island off of Florida, I think it's called Marco Island, that is paying homeowners to allow burrowing owls to burrow in the front yard. Burrowing owls are listed species. This is where the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you have an endangered species on your property, we're going to pay you to take care of it rather than fine you if you use your property. Everybody would want an endangered species. Put a bounty on these invasive ornamentals like calorie pear, one of the worst in the East. That's what Fayetteville, Arkansas did. St. Louis, Missouri, North Carolina's got a bounty on them. If you take out a calorie pear, you get a free tree replacement. Water utilities are giving people $100 coupons to plant water efficient native species instead of the thirsty non-natives. And of course, the big lawn rebate programs that Kristen opened up with. This has gone up now. You get $2.50 per square foot for every square foot of lawn you remove and replace with a xeric planting. And if you want more information on all of those programs, memorize that. All right, I think we've made 3 missteps in the early years of conservation, and the first one's important. We're starting to think of nature as if it's optional. We like nature, and we like to go bird watching or hiking or ride our bikes through it, but it's not essential. And if it's not essential, when push comes to shove, when resources are in short supply, nature takes a back seat. And of course, resources are always in short supply. Went to the Cincinnati Zoo, and there's this wall-sized poster there, which to me epitomizes our societal's view of conservation. We want to save nature, we want to save wildlife so that future generations can enjoy it. That was Teddy Roosevelt's argument for expanding the national park system. Got to save these beautiful places so that future generations can enjoy it. And I get that, because nature is enormously entertaining, but it is much more than that. We need to save nature so that we have future generations. It's a little bit more urgent. We've also assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, we talked about this, but if we restrict conservation just to the places where there's not a lot of humans, we're going to fail, because those places are too small, too few, and too isolated. David Quammen has a great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. That's not 71 Persian rugs. That's 71 rug fragments, none of which are acting like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. I don't like that language, because it suggests there's places on planet Earth with no ecological significance. Not so. Every square inch of the planet has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, even including much of our agriculture. So we need to put the plants back, folks. We need to glue our rug back together again, not just to make biological corridors that allow plant and animal to move back and forth between viable habitats, but to recreate viable habitats in all those places we've destroyed them. It's starting to happen. It really is starting to happen. And when it does, it'll be the first time in modern history that we humans have shared our spaces with nature. We have coexisted with nature. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to just a few specialists, a few conservation biologists, a few ecologists. For some reason, we didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of everybody on the planet. But I don't know why, since every single person on the planet depends entirely on the quality of local ecosystems. So why wouldn't they participate in taking care of those ecosystems? Why wouldn't they share the responsibility? Stan Rushworth, the Cherokee elder, once said, the Western settler mindset was, I have rights. The mindset of indigenous people is, I have obligations. You're not born with those mindsets, you're taught them. We've been very good at teaching this one. We've been terrible at teaching our kids and our peers that we all have obligations to good Earth stewardship. That does not mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it where you live. And if you do, it empowers you. More and more people recognize that the planet has some serious issues, but they all feel powerless. What can one person do? Well, one person can shrink the lawn, one person can modify their lights, one person can plant a pollinator garden, one person can remove their invasive species, one person can fire Mosquito Joe. One person can do all the things we just talked about and revitalize the life right where they live, and then enhance their local ecosystem instead of continuing to degrade it. And it also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You get depressed. Just think about the piece of the earth that you can influence. If you own property, it's obvious. That's where you start. If you don't own property, help somebody who does. Help a land conservancy, help a park or preserve. They're all underfunded. They're all understaffed. They will love you as a volunteer. So as a property owner or a volunteer, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate, and then ultimately our own. So I think I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope. Hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. Wow, so much to take in, but some really recurring themes, and sometimes a lot of information, but it can be in some ways very simple. So you guys are welcome to put any questions in the Q&A. And in terms of us coming out to help you with your home, we do have a landscape design assistance program to help people with designing their landscape. And if part of what you want to do is support biodiversity, that is something to tell your landscape designer. And you can find more information about that at ebmud.com/watersmart.
That's a great service, by the way.
It's a new program for us, and it's very, very popular because it can be a lot to try to figure out how to start.
A stumbling block for a lot of people.
We do have access there, as Doug mentioned. CalScape is a great place to look for keystone species for your specific location. So that's a good place to go for when you're doing your research. And we can also send you a list. We have a list on our website for plants that we recommend for your landscape. Yes, this was recorded, and we will be sending it out. I know there was a lot of information to hear there, but we will be sending it out so you can take a listen to this again and share it with others. So there's some more questions about our landscape design assistance program. And if you just go to ebmud.com/watersmart, you can find out more about our rebates. I will be also sending out a link to these rebates, including the landscape design assistance program, in a follow-up email, so you can look for that within the next week. I'm glad there's a lot of interest in that, and it does tie in really well with this presentation. Thank you. So a question came in: does a natural landscape conflict with fire safety? I'll let you take that one.
I'd rather not. In some sense, it does. I just saw just today, I think, a new rule that says you're not allowed to have plants right next to your house for fire safety, at least 5 feet away. A lot of it has to do with the types of plants you use. So, for example, if there's a canopy fire happening near you, what spreads it, of course, are flying embers. And they've shown that if you have the native California oaks, particularly the live oaks, they actually intercept those embers. So a good barrier of oaks on the perimeter of your property is a plus. It's not a minus. It's tougher to maintain the plants on the ground that we love to see, the leaf litter that encourages the soil community to survive. But remember, you're in a fire climax community where there were small ground fires frequently that would remove that fuel. But you got to reach a compromise. I mean, the reality is the most flammable thing in our neighborhoods is our house themselves. It's not the plants around the house. So making your house fire safe is the first thing you want to do. But You have to be a little sensitive to it. And I know the California Native Plant Society will help you with that in the really fire prone areas. We don't have to worry about it in the East, so I get really lazy about it.
Lucky you. Yes, we also have a brochure on firescaping, so I'll send that also as a link in a follow-up email. Bob Eagle says that they bring back the natives, has a list of East Bay keystone species.
Good.
And that's in the Q&A right now. I don't know if people can see that. Bringingbackthonatives.net, keystone species. So that will be helpful. And I'll also put that in our email follow-up. Any thoughts on trimming of tree branches in fall?
Why would you do that? If you have a tree threatening your house and the branch is dead and you're worried it's going to fall, obviously you trim it. You would, if you've got to prune your tree. I think they're over pruned personally. When you get your pruning advice from your arborist, remember, he's the one who's going to make money from it. So there's a conflict of interest there. But in terms of avoiding the diseases that are inflicting our oaks, like sudden oak death syndrome, out here we've got oak leaf scorch and oak wilt. You don't want to do that during the growing season. You want to do it when things are most dormant, because that's when the spores spread. If you prune your trees when they're actively growing, so you want to avoid that. So fall or winter for sure, late fall or winter, particularly, and you want to do it during your coldest periods. But question it. Do you really have to prune it?
Very good. And also, how do you identify established species in your yard? There's a really great app. I don't know if everyone's aware of this, called Seek. And you just download it, put it on your phone, and it does a really good job at, when you take a picture of it, identifying the species of the plant. So have fun with that, because it's like immediate gratification.
And if that doesn't work, take that picture and send it to iNaturalist. And there are plant geeks out there that will send you an answer in 30 seconds.
I'll put that in the link I'll put that in the email too, as a reminder. Yes, yeah. There's a comment here about making education, making things available to school districts early on. And I want to let you know that we do have a Water Smart Garden Grant, which can also be used for schools in putting in demonstration gardens to teach them more about these regenerative landscapes.
And we do have a young readers version of Nature's Best Hope, which is designed specifically for that, for middle schoolers and a little bit younger than that, to try to get this information to the younger generation.
So there's a question about, shouldn't the insects use the cultivars just like the parent species?
That depends on what the genetic trait was that made the cultivar. So a cultivar is just a genetic slice of the straight species. But sometimes the genetic change actually discourages insect use. So, for example, the one that discourages it the most is taking a green leaf and making it red or purple. That loads the leaf with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. So that I know we love our red leaf cultivars, but they are not wildlife. If you take a flower and you make it a double flower, you're changing the reproductive parts of the flower into petals. So that there is no nectar and there is no pollen. So that's not going to help them at all. But if you take a tall plant, make it short, or introduce disease resistance or some other things, it doesn't seem to impact insects at all. So the answer to that is really, it depends on what the cultivar trait is you're talking about.
So there's a question here about progress nationally to get HOAs to allow lawn reductions in planting native plants. And I just want to answer that from a California point of view, that there are laws in place to to allow homeowners to put in native plants if they're don't want to have lawn. But the question here is about HOAs nationally and if there has been progress with that.
There has been. I don't know if you saw in the New York Times, it's been a couple of months now, but there was an article, I fought the lawn and the lawn lost. It was about a couple in Maryland that sued their HOA because they wanted to have their native plants, and they won. So that sets a legal precedent now, and HOAs are less likely to be challenging their constituents. But remember, what they're worried about is lowering property values. So what we want to do is get more natives into our yard, but we want to do it tastefully. This is where lawn should be used, just little strips of manicured lawn here and there. It's a cue for care. It shows that you are managing your landscape. You know, you're not low class, you haven't moved out, and just let it go to pot. And it really can take a well-planted landscape and make it beautiful. So the object is not to reduce standards. It's to reduce the amount of lawn and get more plants into our landscape, which of course is essential to managing our waterscape. Lawn is the worst thing for watersheds. It pollutes them and causes runoff. Nothing good about it.
Are there any benefits of moles and gophers?
Well, they're part of the local biodiversity. You know, way back in 1955, Margaret MacArthur said, the stability and productivity in an ecosystem depends on the number of species in that ecosystem. And as you lose species, it becomes less stable and less productive. So rather than picking at individual species, say, what good is this one? What good is that one? Look at the number as a whole. Everybody is doing something there. Those, moles and voles and ground squirrels are eating, they're eating the grubs and things underground. They're food for your hawks. They're part of a viable food web. So a landscape without them is one that is not as viable as one with them. So, we have to compromise a little bit. We got to share. This is that sharing nature part I was talking about. Sharing with nature.
Can I put a water feature in my yard and water it with chlorinated water, the only water I have available?
Good question. I would say yes. I mean, geez, we drink chlorinated water and it seems to be okay for us. Water features, particularly in a really dry area, are hotspots for particularly the birds, but a lot of insects go and drink water as well. What you want to do, though, you don't want a standing water in like a bird bath, because that gets stagnant really quickly. What attracts wildlife is little gurgling sounds. It shows that the water is moving. Moving water means clean water. So if you get a little pump in there and circulate it, that's the way to go. And that chlorine, if I'm not mistaken, volatilizes and leaves that your little water feature there pretty quickly anyway. So I would say yes, go ahead and do that.
Yeah, people actually use potable water for their landscapes quite a bit. And there is a new law in California that's gaining some speed, and that is no more non-functional turf on commercial properties starting in 2027. So you're going to see a whole state of biodiversity hotspots, hopefully. And maybe modeling for the country, who knows? Let's see. How about HOA landscaping companies that are not on board with natives? And I'm just going to go ahead and answer this. There are some landscape companies that need a little bit more introduction and training on working with natives and some of these regenerative landscape practices like sheet mulching and adding compost. And my recommendation is that you help them with joining like a Rescape California training and have them go through a professional training. So they're with their peers and learning this information together. And that might be something the HOA would be interested in investing in if they like to stick with that company.
And remember, they work for you. You don't work for them. So you say, this is what I want. If you can't deliver it, I will hire somebody else. And when they hear that enough, they will learn how to do it in the way that makes sense in the future.
Okay, what's this? Okay. Do you have any questions, suggestions about how to deal with? Yeah, there's there's a little bit about, do you have any suggestions, Doug, on how to deal with mice, rats, rodents in the backyard?
Well, rats are attracted to human garbage. So it has nothing to do with native plants. You have rats in the middle of a city where you have no native planting. So you've got to remove that source. Now they will come to bird seed. So if you have a rat problem in your neighborhood and you've got bird feeders, that could be an issue. There are times where you have to get nasty. Rat traps work. They're very smart. You have to be clever about it. Do it in a way where you're not catching anything else. That's true for house mice as well. But those are issues related to animals that want to live around humans because we produce so much food and so much waste. It's not a native plant issue.
In Contra Costa, and maybe Bob, you can write also in here if you'd like, in Contra Costa County, are there laws or ordinances that require drought-resistant landscape or better a certain percentage of native plants in new developments or office parks? So Lisa, there's a new law, 1572, AB 1572, I believe, and Gavin Newsom just signed it for all of California, and it's going to get tiered in starting in 2027 with commercial properties not being prohibited from using drinking water to water non-functional turf. And what we mean by that is property that is not used for recreation. So the hope is that then that gets turned into these native plant gardens. Currently, there is not a law that says you have to use a certain number of native plants, though the legislation is looking at that. I hope that helps. I can send the information about the new law in the email follow-up. And if people see this, Eddie put in a link to the compliance standards for vegetation inspections for the Oakland Hills Fire Zone. Thank you, Eddie, for doing that. Yes. Aren't burrowing rodents needed for ground nesting bees, bumblebees, for example?
They use them. They use holes in rock walls as well. They're opportunistic, but yes, they do use them when they're available.
Very good. Well, we have we got a lot of messages here about just enormous gratitude to Doug for providing this incredibly informational and inspirational presentation. And maybe we'll just take a couple more. Are succulents useful for insects, moths, or should I incorporate leafy plants?
Succulents, we do have some native succulents. Most of the ones that are on the market are not native. When they bloom, there are generalist pollinators that will use them. They're very useful in green roofs because they have short root systems and they can take hot and dry. So they do have uses. If you have the opportunity to use native leafy plants, that's going to help those caterpillars and other things more than succulents. But succulents have a role.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much, Doug. That was amazing presentation and really something that you want to go back to and listen to again. I've heard it a few times and always learn something new. We thank you so much for your time. And thank you everyone who joined us and all your good questions. And we'll be sending out an email with all these links that we talked about today. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.